You know, you just keep it in the bag, go forward.
That's all I can do.
Yeah.
Strolling in.
Good. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this workshop on the application for an amendment to the PDD. As I look out, this is quite an impressive group. So, thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate you all coming here. I'm supposed to, at the beginning of every morning meeting, point out exits. Obviously, those two exits right there. That door isn't labeled, but it can also be an exit. That is not an exit. That's a closet. Okay, that being said, why don't we get started? My sense is tonight, maybe we can have a kind of a general discussion, an overview discussion of the traffic issues. There may be some questions from town board members. We've scheduled 2 nights for this, for workshops at this stage for the application, tonight and November 8th. The board, there's some sense on the board that although we've spent lots and lots of time looking at the application, the comments from Shazen and the other comments from engineers that we've gotten, it might be the best thing to do to postpone the completeness decision, accept or not accept in return to the next workshop, November 8th. And open up that workshop to any kind of traffic issues that we haven't raised tonight, if we're not ready to go into that kind of depth, and then make the decision on the 8th. So that's a decision that the board, can make. But that being said, why don't we get started with the general overview? And Stu, would you like to address it from a 30,000 feet level?
That's the level I'll address that. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody. Stuart Messinger with the Shazen Companies. Part of the reason for folks who aren't aware that this will be a general discussion tonight is our traffic expert, Tom Johnson, isn't able to be here tonight. He had a death in his family, and so he's obviously excused for that. And I will not pretend to be a traffic expert. So 30,000 feet works just fine for me on the details. I wanted to just set the stage. I think everybody knows this, but the purpose of completeness review is to determine whether the draft environmental impact statement submitted by the applicant is complete with respect to the scoping document that you adopted a while back. That is, does it contain the analyses and the data that we asked for in the scoping document? It is, in my experience, always the case that when a draft environmental impact statement is submitted for the first time, it's found incomplete. It's the usual thing for it to be reviewed, for there to be comments submitted back, and for the applicant to be asked to either supply additional information or clarification or so forth. It's important to remember that the draft environmental impact statement is the applicant's document. It's prepared by the applicant, and it may contain conclusions or opinions that are the applicant's. The final environmental impact statement, which will be prepared at the end of the process, is your document. And it's the document that will present your conclusions with respect to the facts and analyses. So the fact that you may not agree with some of the conclusions in the draft is not necessarily a reason to reject it at this point. The point now is, did it cover all of the things that we asked it to cover in the scoping document? So with that said, we performed a review. We've, as I just said, and as is typical, we've suggested that the document should be declared incomplete, and the applicant be asked to provide some additional information. And we've outlined that for you in our set of comments. A lot of it is simply backup data. There are conclusions and analyses in there, but we don't have the supporting backup data in all cases. And so that would be, if I was going to, from a 30,000 foot level, characterize our comments. It's let's go back, let's give us some additional backup for the things that you're saying. And I think that would conclude what I have to say as an opening set of remarks. The one thing I'll point out is I did read the letter from CME also making some comments. What I thought, our take on it, and talking to Tom, and Tom only had a brief amount of time to look at it, is that the things that CMA had asked for in their letter are covered by our comments. They just went through a lot more detail, but the data and so forth that we've asked were really they overlap. But I asked Tom between now and our next workshop to look at that and point out where in our comments those comments might be addressed, or if they are substantive and not related to completeness at this point, then they should be deferred because they wouldn't be part. So I'll have that to you before the 8th. I anticipate Tom will be able to be here at the 8th, and to the extent that we want to talk in more detail, we can then. But again, remember, at the stage we're at, we're looking at, did the document do what we asked it to do in the scoping document? Did the draft environmental impact statement do what we asked it to do in the scoping document? Not do you necessarily agree with the conclusions that were reached, or you think they're good. So that would be my overview. I don't know if Leah, you want to add anything to that?
Thank you very much, Stu. Really appreciate that. Yeah, that'll be very helpful to get those that input after you discuss with Tom on Creighton Manning. All right, Zach, did you want to make some opening comments or refer to anybody else to make the comment?
There we go. Hopefully that works. So I think hopefully there was a few things that we were hoping to hit on. I think at a 30,000 point of view, we really wanted to just try and set a foundation for some of the sections that lead into 3. I know that we really wanted to dive in great detail tonight about the traffic and really get into section 3, but I think that really overlooks sections 1, 2 very high level, and I don't think we really want to spend a lot of time tonight. I don't think that's necessarily to Stu's point. Getting that narrative right is necessarily the point, but also think that could be really helpful. And I think I've heard a lot of comments from different folks involved in the project, but there's been some confusion there. So if that's all right, I think that's where we'd like to start.
Okay.
So with that, I think we can go to Teresa, and I think usually we have you start off. And I think just generally, as we talk about why we're here and why Skinnell has put this application in the first place, right? I think it's really a recognition that Skinnell was introduced and or approached by Luther Forest EDC, who is the owner of the 1400, or who is the owner and the steward of the property here. And has really been charged with being the steward of the 1,400 acre Luther Forest Technology Park. And with that, really, we had been challenged to partner with them and try and help them understand how to spur additional development. We really came here, looked at, our experience across the country at developing sites like this, multi-hundred acre with the focus, and had identified a number of items specifically that we had concerns with. We engaged Pyramid, so Cushman Wakefield, and I think that's what Peter's here for, and we can talk again very high level of kind of some of the concerns that he voiced as someone who'd been involved with the site for over a decade now, and some of the concerns he's had, and some of the reasons that we're trying to update a document that our belief is maybe just gotten a little bit stale since it was put into place 2003 and not necessarily been updated to reflect some of the changes that have been going on in the way that businesses are being run right now, whether that's in the technology sector, whether that's from the perspective of real estate, how we're financing projects, how we're really putting them together. So hopefully that's a really good kind of foundation. Maybe I can ask Peter again, a couple of very quick minutes of just some of the feedback you've had and kind of some of the one of the reasons that we're really here and talking about this.
Yeah, I guess I can. It goes my back. Good evening. My name is Peter Struzzi. I'm the principal broker with Cushman & Wakefield Pyramid Brokerage Company located in Albany. Keeping with the 30,000 foot overview, we have certainly been aware of Luther Forest, the infrastructure that's here, and the desire for development that's occurred across the state. The issues with Luther Forest really came to light about 5 years ago. We were approached by Jones Lang LaSalle, commercial real estate firm out of Chicago, with a requirement that was very substantial. Finding the location that could fit it was difficult. We had 3 in the Capital District. Luther Forest was the choice, frankly, because we couldn't get a definition of when we could supply the property, the building, the finished product. We lost that opportunity. That was with JLL and another developer. I think some of you may remember Insight was here. Insight went away. JLL set up a meeting with Scanel, and that's when Zach came into town, and we started a marketing campaign on the property. Our issue has been with businesses. They simply can't say, well, yeah, we like everything about it, and they do like everything about it. This is a tremendous asset, but until we can give definitive timelines for when development can occur, we will simply miss opportunity after opportunity after opportunity.
Maybe to that end, we can take just a quick dive, and maybe Teresa can lead this through section 2. Just a high-level description of the proposed action. I think especially some of the comments that we've received throughout, especially about the traffic section, seemed to me to kind of miss a little bit of the point of what's remaining in the PDD versus what we've proposed to change. So if that's okay, maybe we just have Teresa. Hopefully we all can turn to section 2, and we can probably do a very quick high-level run through table 2.1-1.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you. So the first thing we tried to clarify is just the amount of square footage of net leasable area. And we also had to define net leasable area because there wasn't a definition of it in the current PDD. So the idea in all of this is just to set things in place so people can reliably figure out what they can build and what they need to be concerned about in terms of square footage. We also added new permitted principal uses, and we tried to decouple from the chip fab business relation so that we could have other types of uses in the park, but which were still technology and light industrial, as well as research and development facilities. We tried to expand the definition of campus commercial and also to look at freestanding buildings that may be part of one particular use. We also looked at ancillary building types that are usually needed by these businesses. Maintenance facilities, buildings, outdoor storage, water storage, data centers. Data is a big part of most businesses these days and may even be, separately housed. We also took out the special use permit requirement. We left in the site plan, of course, for the planning board, but the reason why we took out the special use permit is because this PDD represents what is allowed It's a deliberate decision about what uses are allowed within Luther Forest Tech Campus. And once that decision's been made by the town board, there's really no reason to determine if a special use permit is required, where you're looking at whether it fits the character and everything else. It really, and I think if you look at the type of special use permit analysis that the town of Malta goes through when they look at this, it has like 12 factors, takes a lot of time. People want to know if you want them or not from the get-go. And if you can meet the bulk requirements, and if you're within the uses that are allowed, they want to have some certainty that they won't be turned down. A few of the other ones that we looked at here, and a lot of them are sort of consistent with the town's past practices, like allowing entities to apply for soil disturbance approval prior to issuance of site plan approval, which can be very important given the amount of time it takes to build on any site in New York. We have proposed to have more flexibility with the buffers in relation to the arterial roads. We have put, I believe we've shown everybody the drawing before showing how that would be changed. And really, again, that's just primarily to give more flexibility in terms of areas that may need to be graded or really can't be just undisturbed in that first 50 feet. I don't know if everybody realizes, I assume most people do, I know Dennis does. There's a lot of stuff out there right now, a lot of stuff that needs to come down that's in particularly bad shape. And, you know, that in and of itself is going to lead to disturbance within those buffer areas. So we're trying to be realistic about what can be accomplished or not be accomplished. We have not really changed the landscaping guidelines much. The same way with the green space, what we tried to do there was just make more certain what we thought the reality was, which was that the majority of the green space out there has been preserved in the campus already. And then we tried to come up with a number that would fit within the overall goals for green space for the campus as a whole. And we addressed some issues concerning parking and also concerning architectural and aesthetic details. I think someone had said that there was, you know, a goal to have metal walled buildings out there. That is not at all the case. What we have in here is, you know, the type of construction that would be attractive and consistent with other uses currently in the park or the step park. What you have out there now are a lot of metal walled buildings. We certainly don't want to replicate that. Let's see. One of the things that people have consistently objected to is this idea that independent environmental audits will be given to the town. That's a problem for people, obviously, because towns are subject to FOIL, and it's difficult when you're in a business that's completely transparent, as towns are. It's difficult to maintain information like that and make sure that it doesn't get into the wrong hands. We have proposed to make the height requirements more similar to the height requirements in development area 1. We think, and Zach, you can tell me if I'm wrong, that in most cases, we're still going to be down at a much lower height than what we've put in there. But again, you know, we want to show some amount of flexibility so we can at least get people to come and look and consider coming here. We have tried to work within the existing thresholds. For instance, I know we're looking at traffic at a very high level, but the thresholds are actually established in the PDD legislation for the development areas outside development area 1. And so when Wendy and Alana did their analysis, what they assumed was that that's the threshold, that's the approved threshold, and we could only build to that threshold. And I think, Wendy, you'll talk about that. And I think if that's okay with you, I think that's where we should go next.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think just to summarize everything that I was trying to get through, Peter was trying to get through, and Teresa, and I know we said we would keep that to a couple of minutes, and I think we might have gone over a couple, unfortunately, but I think the short version was we were really coming into this, not necessarily with the user in mind, not necessarily with this particular entity that we're trying to bring to the park. It's really more from the point of view of we are really good experts of understanding what large corporations, Fortune 100 companies need to see when they're searching for sites, and pairing that with the expertise that a lot of folks that have been here for a long time and working on this park, whether it's a Pyramid with Peter Struzzi, whether it's Dennis at SEDC, or the folks at the EDC, try to hear some of the stories of why they think projects in the past haven't come to fruition and try to improve on that. I can tell you time and time again, in the last year since we've become involved with the project, and Peter's point of marketing it, we have gotten a lot of very serious engagement from what I would call very high quality, good technology users. And time and time again, when we start talking to them about the land use restrictions here and the PDD amendment, every single one of them has told us, call us when you're done with your PDD amendment. We can't wait to be there, but not under these conditions. And I think we probably didn't do enough time, and I know that's not the purpose of tonight's meeting, to really go through what those specific items are and where those pain points exist. But I think that's really our intent with all of this. And I hope that's the lens that we can all kind of share in this together, of the shared goal of seeing projects, jobs, and employers start coming and joining the Luther family. So I think if that's good, we can, I guess at the will of the board, we can turn over to VHB and let them go through a 30,000 of the section of 3 that applies to the TIA and some of those items, or
Okay,
your will is.
sure. Who's next then?
Do you want?
Deputy Wendy? Okay, Wendy.
So is it easiest to go through kind of the matrix that Jason had provided? Is that the kind of the easiest thing to do, to start and go through it? Or did you want a general discussion? What do you prefer?
Sure. I mean, we'd like to
the-
hear from you, and then, my sense is to hear from you, and then, open it up and allow board members to have questions from, the parties or people in the
Okay.
room.
So I think to Stu's point, several of the comments that we got regarding the completeness are, asking for some additional information. One of them is, as Teresa had referenced, is where did we come up with that threshold? So the PDD had for the adjacent street traffic, the threshold for the full development were 2,400 in the AM peak hour and 2,500 in the PM peak hour. So where we came up with our threshold is we did, remove some trips out of that threshold for
Sorry,
development that's built already
Wendy,
in, I'm
real
sorry.
real quick, would it be helpful if we just went very quick through section 3.1 and give a very just foundational, here's what we did?
Yeah.
Sure.
We
Sure.
did that.
Introduction to what we're
Sorry.
talking about before we go through comments. Thank you.
I was stuck on the threshold because I knew that's a big question. So just an overarching of our, our full scope of services was, very consistent with what was completed for the FAB 8.2, which is really, it's stated right in the scope of services that, this study will mimic, the study area and much of the analysis that was done, obviously now for this PDD amendment that's proposed. So we did look at 28 intersections, which again is consistent with what has been studied, throughout the LFTC campus studies. We did a crash evaluation. We also did a pavement evaluation, which is something that was not done prior, but it was something that was added in for this. Some of the other scope items were, obviously COVID has had an impact on transportation. So there was some specifics about COVID adjustments. And also there was some specifics in that scope on how to develop our volumes, because similarly with COVID, where, we would typically go out and count every intersection. There was a much different approach where we counted several intersections and then used a lot of the resources of all the studies that have been done to come up with that base condition volume, knowing that going out there and counting everything wasn't necessarily going to give us the best base condition. And then our analysis was done for a build condition with a PDD amendment, that maximum build out that we talked about with those thresholds. And then it was also done using the prior study for the FAB 8.2. That was an ask as well, like if 8.2 did come and the projects were piggybacked, what would they, where would there be impacts as well? So that's the 30,000.
Thank you very much, Wendy.
Sure.
Okay. Who's next, Zach?
I think that was everything that we
you're
were going
good.
to start setting a foundation.
Okay, with the knowledge that what we might do is, pick this up on November 8th and work on our completeness review on both traffic and non-traffic. And depending on whether the board wants to go that direction or not, I'll just open it up now for any questions that the board might have on this 30,000 foot view.
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed in Teresa's presentation that I didn't hear you speak to is the warehouse distribution use. And there has been a lot of conjecture and discussion around what some folks are assuming this project to be or represent. I was hoping that you or perhaps Zach could share a little bit more insight, both from a market standpoint, an intended use standpoint, and expectations for that use, and how that's going to relate in comparison to some of the other uses that have been proposed here.
Sure, I'll take the first stab. So I think as we look at the PDD as it's written today, it's really set up very specifically to accommodate and to have a lot of guidance around ancillary development towards tech fab. And I think we can write probably a decision for the board is whether or not that's something that's appropriate to amend. I think when we look at this as a full tech park and maybe getting more to the auxiliary products that go alongside of that, necessarily from the defined term of ancillary, that we started to have a lot of concern. And I think what we heard from folks that have been here for a while, there was a lot of concern from users in the past about how that actually gets interpreted and how that gets defined. I think when we think of, if you say, I think what everyone's dream here, and especially mine, first and foremost, right, would be a single user comes forward, says, we want to put a corporate campus here with our R&D, our manufacturing, our headquarters, everything there. And I think when you start to think about that user and that vision, you start to see that there's not a single use that can be in any given building or a campus of buildings. It's going to be a good mixture. And I think it's from that perspective that we were really looking at the warehouse and then the other uses that we've added as well and redefined. I think the warehouse gets a lot of attention because it's a big thing when you read the news. I think right now in land use and development across the country, there's a lot of concern about what the future of warehouse looks like, how much space is required.
I'm confused because we were presented with a conceptual site plan that showed 3.15 million square feet
Yes.
of last mile warehouse distribution facility. That's what we were shown.
No, I think the site
No,
plans.
no,
Hang on.
that's what we
I'll
got.
respond. So I think the site
So
plans.
we're
the site
supposed to
plans that
pretend like we didn't get that.
No, I think the site plans that we showed were a realistic visualization. I think what's hard, right, is when we talk to manufacturing users, right, they want to be able to see the flexibility that a space can provide. So would an actual user build out docks of a certain size? I can't tell you, right, what the actual end user is going to look like one or the other on that. What I can tell you is a user, I talk to them all the time, manufacturing user of, let's say, 300,000 square feet that only has 6 dock doors, wants to see when they're doing their initial site search, a site plan that shows they have the ability to have dock doors anywhere on the building with max flexibility. I'm just, this is how we market buildings across the country. This is the conversations I have all the time with manufacturing. That's my experience working with those kinds of users, is that that's what they like to see. Whether or not it's what the actual building that gets constructed looks like.
Well, that's the authority you asked us to give you. Just your application asks us to allow you the authority to do a build of what you show, that 3.15 million square feet of last mile warehouse. That's what you've asked us to give you the authority to build. If you've got something else in mind, maybe you shouldn't ask us for that.
I think that there's a number of restrictions on development that's being proposed in the PDD, and you know, we can make this a page turn on the PDD. I'd love to do that, and I would love the opportunity to talk through which individual portions of the PDD I think become restrictive and protect against the development like you're describing, where you have a very high truck use and really a truck terminal type facility. I don't think there's any way that could ever get built the way we proposed the PDD amendment. I think there's obviously going to be a site plan review that comes with any development, and there's got to be further review as individual users come forward. I think our goal from this is to give, to Peter's point, more clarity and consistency about what's allowed versus what requires further review, because what we struggle with is having users step forward that can share our vision, but don't necessarily have a clear path forward on how to get that reviewed and entitled, when every user has to come forward and propose a unique PDD amendment for them and has to go through a special exception review and entitlement process. That becomes burdensome, especially at a project this size. We're not dealing with groups that have decided necessarily they want to come to the capital district. A lot of these users are looking across the country.
I totally get that point, and it's a valid point. But what you've done is you've taken, your application represents something very extreme change to what's in there, and the change that you pretty much conceded tonight is really not even necessary for what you reasonably expect will happen. And so we're all sitting here knocked back on our heels with this extreme proposal that you've asked our community to accept, and that's really probably not what's going to happen. So I don't understand why we would even proceed on the basis of the application you've submitted.
Yeah, I would tell you that I think a few things. I think the application that's been proposed corresponds to the vision that I have for this, which is exactly as I just described it. I think we hopefully at some point it'll be appropriate for us to have that conversation with this board and go through a page turn and describe each individual item and how it plays out that way. That's a conversation I'm very excited to have with y'all when the time's right and when we're able to. I don't think that there's been any inconsistencies. I think the biggest thing that I would look back and say we've created confusion is I think the way that I'm used to marketing a building for that kind of user is not necessarily rectify with the vision of what a building ends up looking like at the end of the day. And I definitely can understand that being confusing and that feeling like we're going kind of away. And I think there's a number of items in the PDD that protect against that. And again, we can dive through that now if it's appropriate, or if we want to hit that on a different date, we can do it then as well.
Well, I had some further questions on sort of the section 2, and I'll say I'm not on my heels from these discussions, so that's not those words didn't come out of my mouth, and that's not how I feel. I've understood this from the start, and understand that you're proposing a multitude of uses here across several million square feet of use on a project that has not been successfully built out in 2 decades. The other question I had on specific uses, something that's always rubbed me the wrong way within this PDD. I've always seen it as an issue, and I've always seen it as really nearly fatal to the use, is the definition of nanotechnology manufacturing facilities. I guess, I'm wondering, in your experience, what are nanotechnology manufacturing facilities, and how often are those built? And because in my experience, I don't think we currently have a nanotechnology manufacturing facility in this town, and I'm not sure that this use aligns with any market use.
I mean, I could speak probably generally from kind of a high level. I'll be the first one to admit, I am definitely not the expert in nanotechnologies and conductor fabrication. I probably look at Peter here in a few seconds, because since we've been engaged, he has been spending a lot of resources trying to advertise towards that community specifically. He could talk a little bit about that and some of the specific feedback that we've gotten over the last year from those kinds of users. Because I think you've told me in the past, you've had emails with more than a few dozen, I'll put it that way, before Peter gives you the actual, stats there. I think high level, we've heard a lot of concern about the utilities on site and its ability to support one. We've heard a lot of concern about the ability to really co-locate and invest in the cluster. I think that I understand that was the vision of what this park was going to be. And I think a lot has changed again over the last 18 years now since the original PDD was approved. And I think because of that, and some of the segmentation and of what's happened in that industry, you don't see the amount of collaboration I think we would have all expected or loved to see with any cluster being set up. And I realize I missed half of your question, Councilperson Hartzell, which is, I think I don't want to, and no one at this table wants to downplay the significance of the request we've got in front of the board. This is not a small, I don't think anyone here is saying this is a small revision to the PDD. It's a very large conceptual question of, do we want to make these changes as a town? Do you all want to make these changes as a town or not? And I think that's the will of y'all's view, right? And we can only bring to this our expertise and what we've been hearing from the market. But I don't know if you can elaborate a little bit more about what you've heard in the last 12 months.
In our marketing, companies like to piggyback on ongoing concerns. We have the School of Nanoscience in Albany. Everyone is very well aware of that. That would be nanoscience manufacturing on a small scale down there. We have tried to piggyback on that. I think I would go back to our marketing people to talk about how many hits and emails we've sent out to specific nanotechnology companies. We also have a biomed property in the city of Albany, the Center for Medical Science, where we represent that property. We have piggybacked on our marketing of the CMS facility to make companies that do biomedical production aware of the Luther Forest opportunity. But to the point, we get back to, okay, if we look, when can we be in? And I think that's why we're here tonight.
Thank you. All right, follow-up questions from the board?
Can I just say one thing? Like John, I'm a little bit concerned about the fact that you're asking us to add a lot of different uses: warehouse, distribution, last mile centers, technology, light industrial, research development facilities, campus commercial. But we don't really have any idea of what real tenants they'll be. I mean, I think it's more like 3.5 million square feet, and it could be all warehouse. There could be no, if we make those uses, there could be no technology and light industrial research and development. And I guess that's what bothers me, is not knowing at all who something more specific about what actually in the end will be built. And I don't understand how we can determine what the traffic impacts will be, even if we don't know who the end user is going to be.
I mean, I think the simple answer to that is that we as a town, or y'all are protected by the thresholds that are currently in the PDD. I think all we're really trying to do with the thresholds, the way they're set up right now, they're very ambiguous of who gets to access those thresholds, where they come. It kind of, I've always just thought of it right now of how when I read the current PDD, it's almost a race to the application table. The first applicant gets to take everything. So if you had a use there that came in and had a very high traffic count, very small square footage, there's nothing in the PDD right now that protects against that. We're trying to really bifurcate that, set aside which pods, not only the pods that we're interested in applying for, but also the remaining, how much traffic count they've got. And I think, again, we can turn it over to Wendy and VHB and try and help us all understand kind of the matrix and how we see different development scenarios playing out and filling those thresholds and also allowing us to hit the square footage. But I think the short answer is, very frankly, you cannot have a warehouse use of 3.5 million square feet and still stay under the thresholds that are in the PDD today. It just cannot happen.
Why don't you modify your application so that that's off the table? I mean, what use at 3.5 million square feet would keep you under the threshold?
I think, again, it's not a single use. I don't think there'll be a single use throughout the entire 1,400 acre park.
Will you ever be able to put any configuration of uses at 3.5 million square feet that would keep you under the threshold? And if not,
Multiple.
Why not drop?
No, multiple. Maybe Wendy, you can, I know you've prepared a couple of development scenarios. Maybe you can help us understand what a couple of them could look like.
Sure. So, like you say, it's kind of like a puzzle to get to that 3.5
You
million,
laid it out
because
there for us, right, in your study, right? You've
Yeah,
shown us that.
yeah, exactly.
Maybe you
But
could refer us to the page so we can.
I don't, I had done some additional that just basically talked about some scenarios where you could get to 3.5 million square feet and still be under that 1,900 and 2,100 trip threshold. Is if you had like a 1 million square foot warehouse, not talking about the high cube warehousing, but just a warehouse facility, and 2.5 million square feet of manufacturing. Those are two uses together that would equate to the 3.5 million and be within those thresholds that are established. There's other land uses that, may not get there if there's a combination of them. And again, it depends on who's coming to the table, but a research and development center in itself could be at 3.5 million square feet in size and get to that, be underneath that threshold. So, it's a bit of a puzzle, as most PDDs that have like a combination of different types of land uses, because, that you get to that threshold of traffic.
But don't you take the position that you're not gonna evaluate 3.5 million square feet of development? Didn't you take that position in your memo back to Chazen?
Well, the reason why is because the thresholds are traffic thresholds. So if we did a scenario of 3.5 million square feet, we could potentially be doing, this combination of all these different types of land uses. So at the end, it really doesn't matter as long as you're at that threshold. So really, that's what you need to analyze, because that's what's going to be the determining factor of what can and can't be built. So in a PDD, you have this, varies of land uses, and then someone comes in and says, I want to build here. And that part of that ability to build is looking at the traffic and determining that they're within that threshold. If someone comes to build and they're over that threshold, then they're not consistent with the PDD, and they can't build under the PDD.
Right, so we don't know in advance what will happen. We have to assume that all of it will be built up to 3.5 million square feet, right?
If it stays within the trip thresholds, there is a potential for that, yes.
But you don't evaluate that here, right? You take the position that you don't have.
We evaluated the maximum trips. So it doesn't matter with the land use. Doesn't necessarily matter, because you're at the trip. So I could say it was, X or Y or Z, but as long as you're within that threshold that's already been established in the existing PDD, then that could be considered a size and land use or combination of different mixes or uses. If they all fall within the volume.
So Wendy, if I could ask just real quickly, I don't mean to sound foolish here, but how many trips would you expect with a bakery, for example? Would that be one of the possible uses of bakery in what you're proposing now?
It could be. I mean, I don't have a bakery land use going on the top of my
There's
head.
been
but
no talk of bakery in here?
They're not specifically what we're looking at. Well, if it's like a light and, we. look
I only
light
asked
industrial
because we had a meeting
manufacturing.
not long
Yeah.
ago, I believe, with Zachary, and a bakery was one of the potential uses for in there. And I'm just curious, how do you estimate trip generation with a bakery? Would it be sales, distribution? Would it be products? What are we talking about with a bakery? And just for the record, if we're keeping score. I'm one of those folks that's kind of back on my heels
Right.
through this whole thing because I've seen a number of these and participated in meetings at the planning board level. And this is like a completely brand new application in front of me. So I'm a little bit lost here.
No, so I can help. So I think when we think about, I know we've had conversations about a potential use that maybe could come in, that was a pretty large scale bakery. I think of the land use codes that we analyzed, and I'll let, Wendy correct me where I'm wrong or I said out of base, but I would think that was closest to the land use code 140. I'm looking on page 3-10, which kind of breaks out all the land use codes and how many trips they all generate at increments of square footage. So you see that land use code, you could easily support 3 million square feet plus. I think the other thing to distinguish when we talk about square footage, I think we probably overpassed this a little bit, is again, it was an undefined term previously. So previously, the park was set up for square footage, and what we don't know, it's funny because I had a conversation this morning with a different town in this area. Very similar thing about what does square footage mean in PDD, and their interpretation that was footprint. The way we've set this up is not to make it based on footprint. So if you have a multi-level facility, you would compound, on each floor. But I think short answer to your question, Mr. Harmon, is you could do manufacturing land use code. So we were talking about a sub 500,000 square foot bakery. I think you'd be expecting, based on the information we know today, to be under 310 trips in the AM peak and under 330 trips in the PM peak. But again, I think our comment continues to be, as each user steps forward, we're going to have to prove out to the town what their trip generation rates are and how that compares to what amount of the capacity of the threshold that exists per the PDD comes in. So your real protection against a higher use is the PDD explicitly prohibits it.
So it's probably safe to say you have absolutely zero idea of what would be in this right now as it's laid out.
I think we've got a number of visions, but correct. We have no tenant in tow, right? We are trying again to make this as appetizing for the market to try and spur development as possible. That is my number one goal and objective through everything we're doing on this park.
Zach, one of the things that seems to be of greatest concern with folks that I talk to is the warehouse use here. And a lot of folks have suggested that suddenly we're going to have a 3.5 million square foot Amazon warehouse if this PDD goes forward. I know it's just one of the uses that you're discussing. Is as a primary use, is there a way to eliminate or limit the threshold on warehouse land use within this PDD without destroying any viability in the marketplace? Meaning, could you say, take warehouse out or limit warehouse to 100,000 square feet or some other limiting factors that doesn't injure terribly the market viability of this proposal?
I think the short answer is we can absolutely talk about dividing up the square footage threshold and or the traffic if we want to do that as well amongst the various uses. I think though, again, it comes down to, we all want to have the right blend of uses. So I think in order to support any kind of user, you're going to have that mixture.
Exactly. The biggest issue that I have is we have a real class act tech area here. I do not want to destroy that. I do not want a warehouse as such in the middle of a national highlight, which is the biggest thing that we have here. The biggest problem that I have, I understand you have to be flexible. I get that. You got to put it out there. It has to be attractive. But as a town board guy who has to answer to all the questions of the residents, I have a hard time giving up a tech park for a massive warehouse. And I'm just saying a warehouse. I understand how it has to be flexible to just get it out there on the market. They want to be in it ASAP. Hey, I get that. but it leaves the town board in a very questionable stance when we have to go back and answer to the people that we represent. We have to be in the best interest of the town and global boundaries also, because they've been a good, I mean, that they help us out in so many ways. And they have grown and they've done what they've said. So we're kind of looking to you as to how can you work with us to expand the park, to work within global and keep the traffic to a minimum standpoint. And I know there's people out there that are very interested in it because they have asked me.
No, and I agree. I mean, very, very, if I cannot say this clear enough, there is zero intention from anybody at Scanel, from the ownership to the lowest analyst, to have a low use, long-term storage type of facility here. Our vision is to continue the tech park. I think it's maybe a little bit different vision than what was proposed in 2003, being really specific to nanotechnology with a 4 fab facility. But as 100% our goal here, I don't think there's anything other there. And I think,
How can you guarantee to us that that'll happen though? With still being flexible.
yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things, one is, I mean, I think when you talk about traffic, right? And that's the purpose of tonight.
That's the biggest concern.
and-
That's more questions than I ever get.
I'll tell you, we started this, I think we started our first meeting with anybody and we've not varied from this message one iota. Our
Right.
intent from day one was not to change a single threshold that was set up in the PDD and or the original SGS or the GIS or the supplementals that had been approved prior to us. And I think what we've proven out in here is that that is completely doable. That we have not proposed any significant changes to the PDDs and none at all so far as thresholds that don't. I think the only one we've got at all that's changed is the square footage as far as thresholds. We've not changed the traffic at all.
That kind of goes right to the heart of this, and it might have to be answered next time we get together. But I have again, I'm perhaps the most difficult to educate in the room. I've done some of this stuff before, but it's been a long time. I've spent a lot of time reading this stuff. I thought I had it straight, and then I read it again, and I don't have it straight. But it seemed like there were some kind of fundamental disconnects for me. One of which is in the TIAS that you guys completed for us was the statement that in the original seeker record, Global's peak traffic is assumed to occur during non-peak hours. You guys state that a number of times in your report. Is that really what's going on right now? Is Global's peak traffic during non-peak hours? That isn't that. Either it is or it isn't. What do we know about that?
So I can say that the study that was done for 8.2 did reveal that there was more traffic in the peak hours than was anticipated in the original approvals. The original approvals was said that 90% of their traffic was within the outside peak. That's why there was 2 thresholds set up in the PDD. In the first place, there was that peak of the generator, and then there was the peak of the adjacent street, which is what was really considered the ancillary, which the bulk of that was really meant for the pods that we're looking at developing 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 9. Yeah,
I understand, but things changed, and thank God they did. We wound up with world-class manufacturer bringing a $300 million annual payroll into our town, made a $15 billion investment. So things are different than traditional secret record. But what I'm trying to understand is, right now we need to start from reality, right? And in looking at what peak capacity is left to consume before you get to phase 4, what is assumed about Global Foundries traffic, both the existing and what would come from 8.2?
So we did not study the global foundries that I can't speak to the global foundries because that's not something I can speak to in detail. But what the existing conditions that we studied have the existing global foundries traffic in it. So that is in the system. So whatever we've put on top of that is cumulative to what is at Global Foundries. And then, like I said, we had to do a supplemental analysis that included the 8.2, which was contemplated several years ago.
And again, I'm such a hard person to
Sorry.
educate, forgive me, because I have to like follow on questions. So I saw there was reference to the 2018 Global Foundries traffic data, right? Is that what you're referring to?
Correct. The study that was done for Fab 8.2,
I
correct?
know the 2018.
Oh,
There was a 2018 CME study done.
Okay.
Sample done of what the actual peak traffic was, right?
right.
Is
Yeah.
that what you assumed is the current peak traffic from global?
Yeah, but we did not separate that out that was part of what we looked at when we were factoring our existing condition volumes, when I had referred to, the methodology that was put into the scoping document to come up with existing volumes was a combination of looking at many different resources. So that is one of the resources we use to account for global. Like, we did not take global and separate it out as part of our study.
What I'm trying to get at is, again, you're gonna have to, unfortunately, you're over assuming my intelligence probably with your answer. We have to forecast. We have to start with the reality that we have right now, right? And what makes it tricky is that reality right now is a reality that we hope ends real soon, right? With COVID. So Global Foundries is producing, and everyone around here is producing a certain volume of peak traffic during AM, PM peak hours. And that is what it is. And that consumes a certain amount of capacity of those intersections. Right.
That's absolutely correct, right? So making sure, hi. So the base existing traffic volumes, in addition to using the resources available as far as factoring up any type of information, we did also do existing traffic counts. So that would have included whatever was going on at Global Foundries at the time of those counts. But then those were increased in order to account for development that's occurred within the town itself, all that kind of stuff. So those base volumes do include in our peak hours of analysis,
Okay.
whatever's going on right now.
All right, so we know that COVID has impacted. First of all, I would tell you that there are some projects in your list, and I know you talked to local folks here. There are some projects approved and under construction that are not included. But the trick that everybody has right now is to figure out, well, what do we do to adjust for COVID? Because I don't know exactly what's going on at global and around here as far as COVID impacts on traffic. I know that DOT has some notion as to how you're to adjust for it. Were those COVID adjustments all made? And did you talk to global about how their own workforce changes may have varied from what is assumed to be a normal workforce change, traffic impact wise?
Unfortunately, that information from Global wasn't available to us as far as, how they're operating now versus how they may have been operating, 2 years ago, I guess, at this point. So we don't have that type of information to add in. We'd certainly love to have that information to add in. That'd be great. I think it would benefit all. But what we did do was look at the plethora of information that's available. One of the things that happens in Malta, and certainly in this part of Saratoga County, is there's a lot of traffic volume data and there's a lot of studies. And so there's a lot of information to work through as we're trying to figure out what those base volumes are going to be. But we also found over the last year or so, say for the first 6 months, and I'm sure you all probably noticed it too, like there was just that kind of so very different on the roadways than what would have been typical. But what we've seen over the last year even, right? So since those first 3 to 6 months, even over the summer of 2020, traffic volumes in our area had really normalized quite a bit. Things had gotten much more back to normal. So there wasn't that much of an adjustment to make when it came to that. It was more of a matter of using the old data. Say we had some information from 2013, 2009, 2016, 2018, so, some from 2020, some from 2021 that we had counted in order to take care of these things, and just accounting for all of that data and coming up with something that made sense, because growth rates in our area had started to normalize anyway, right? So 20 years ago, you always said 2% growth rate. That's what's going on. But everything had been more like a 0.25% or an 1/8% per year. So we didn't want to overestimate what could potentially be the base, but we wanted to make sure we were capturing everything that could be there.
Malta, of course, didn't grow at 0.25% per year. We grew 2,500 people, right?
And parts, but it's also parts. This is a study of the entire town and some areas outside of the town. Not every intersection in the community grew at a rate of 2% per year for the last 20 years, or not, so it's different at each location, but you need to actually do something that's going to make sense as the baseline.
That's a concern of mine. I understand. So we were trying to figure out, well, how much of the pie is left to eat here, right? We all want it to be a lot, but we want to not overassume pie, right? And that remains a concern of mine. The other thing that I didn't understand is, but the way that statement was made, that Global's, peak hour traffic that was supposed to not happen in peak hours, I was interpreting that to mean you guys assumed that all of Global's actual peak hour traffic is available to you. That's not the case.
No, what it was used for instead was to establish that potential trip generation threshold, because not knowing what percentage of the existing traffic is attributed to the global foundries, we're not able to then say, well, it was going to be 2,400 trips that are available. Then we took trips out for NYSERDA and took trips out for potential growth in a couple of the different pods. And then we were left over, right, with these 1,900 and this 2,100 trips. And not knowing how much of Global's current traffic is actually within that 1,900 and 2,100 trips, we couldn't just arbitrarily take a number out, because the threshold that been established in the PDD was the 24 and the 25. We had to do something that still matched the PDD language and did what essentially would be the full analysis of that potential worst case impact, right? Because if we take out some of global traffic, say it's 500 trips, doesn't matter what that number is. But if we had taken those 500 trips out of the threshold, you wouldn't have a worst case analysis to look at right now, because there'd still be an additional 500 trips that could have been added to the analysis. So this was really trying to give you that worst case look.
A couple things, and again, I may have overlooked them, so forgive me, because I had a hard time keeping all this stuff straight. But one of the requirements of the scope that the town board adopted was to evaluate impact, assuming 8.2 had occurred. And so that's one requirement. And then over here, we've got information from Jason that says we've got 366 AM peak trips available and 526 PM peak trips available. So I'm thinking, okay, that's not a lot, If global does 8.2, I would think that would pretty much chew all those up. So how can there be anything else in the, in the mix? And maybe Stu, that's a question for you.
I'm afraid I don't know where those numbers come
Yeah,
from.
where you get the numbers? What do you read from? You had sent a memo like earlier this year, you had sent us a kind of a summary memo. You had sent it to Darren and Darren shared it with the board. Then I'm also referring to Kate Manning had done an analysis in 2014. Sent it to Tom Fruin. And this information is in several places, both your memo and this Kate Manning analysis that says 300 and, or excuse me, I guess it does, this memo does assume the build out of 8.2. So with the assumed, this memo assumes that with the build out of 8.2, there's 366 AM and 526 PM trips available. And the same thing was repeated in your kind of summary memo to us to later, earlier this year. So when I look at that,
That's the 2014 memo you're talking about?
no, your memo to us this year, you did this high level analysis in the spring to look at kind of, yep. And these were the numbers in your memo, 366 and 526. Okay, so that does assume that 8.2 is built. So as far as I know, our expert engineer, Chazen, is saying this is how many trips are available. Why should I think any different than that?
Right. And so I need to go back and look at all that before we verify, and I need Tom here. But that's the critical, that is, I think, your critical question is, you have a number of trips that are available. If you have 8.2, it uses up some number of trips and leaves some available. That's the threshold question. We got to get to the exact numbers, and I'm not prepared to comment any further on them tonight without going back and looking at the memos and talking to Tom. But that's the question, right?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question, John? Well, you take a little rest down there for a second. I know you have more. And again, this stuff's way above my pay grade. Like John, I read something and I think I understand it, and then I go back and read it again the next day, and it means something different. But I do have a question about some of the things. And this is just one example, is your analysis of US Route 9, 67, and Dunning, obviously the big roundabout. And you start out by talking about, with 8.2 being, already built. And then the last statement in highlights is, since the level of service E or F condition will occur prior to the build conditions, it's anticipated that the above identified mitigation measures will have been implicated in the no build condition. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm assuming you mean that 8.2 has been built, so Global Foundries has made the mitigation members. No, that's not what that means.
No, so that means that just kind of with your anticipated growth that's going to be occurring in the community over the next 5-6 years, that intersection will operate at level of service EF conditions. So that's not with Global Foundries, and that's not with any further growth for a PDD change. It's just in the future, that's what you can expect.
Okay, so all of these that say that, you're not anticipating that those improvements will have been made as a result of the traffic impacts for
Right,
8.2.
so that would instead be more of the GEIS fees that the community collects and uses to implement various mitigation measures throughout the town as part of your overall townwide GEIS.
So again, my feeble mind is thinking, and unfortunately, I can't speak when I finish this thinking. So we went through this analysis in which I had great pleasure of spending a summer with Wendy across the table. And, we came up with, I don't know if it was 8 traffic mitigation requirements that had to be constructed. So that's like a kind of a baseline up here in my simple mind of, okay, we know if they do 8.2, you gotta do that. What I heard you just say is you're assuming for your own impact analysis that 8.2 is not built and those mitigation measures were not built. Did I understand that correctly?
So the assumption that we made is that because the intersection would be at that kind of EF condition without construction of 8.2 and without, any changes to the PDD or development that as growth and development occurs, right? So a company comes in, they want to build, you collect your mitigation fees. So there would be growth and development within the community where you're getting those mitigation fees to come in. And then that is how those mitigations would be made. It would not be through 8.2 or global impact.
Okay, I wish I was an engineer, but I'm not, because I might have been able to keep up. So, my simple mind thinks, okay, global with 8.2 is going to present or create a certain number of peak hour trips through these series of intersections. As a result of that, Wendy's analysis in 2012 identified, 8 kind of construction projects that were needed. Okay, fast forward to today. You seem to be saying that your analysis of mitigation required at these intersections doesn't necessarily affect the overcrowding building. You're going based upon impact, peak hour traffic impact that your development will produce. Is that assumption correct?
So it's kind of a combination of what you're saying. So what our build condition does, like that no build where we identify that there's capacity constraints in the no build, that's where we're saying that there's capacity constraints before 8.2, if 8.2 happens, and before any PDD amendment projects come in. So our build analysis then would show the impacts of the PDD amendment project. So what we're doing is we're differentiating to say, if there's a capacity issue that isn't related to the PDD, that we're separating that, because the PDD amendment's not responsible for fixing capacity issues that are going to exist on the roadway system before we make any changes. So that's why those intersections are pointed out to that effect, to say, there are capacity issues here. They're not related to this project. Then we point out what happens with the project.
So wait, maybe I can try.
Well, the
Yeah.
PDD amendment.
Maybe I can
Yeah.
try, because as bad as you think you are, I've driven Wendy and Alana up the wall 10 times higher than you can ever build for them, because I get the advantage of not 1 3-hour session, but like 10 of them. So trust me, I've given them a lot harder time than you can. The way I've thought about, the way that they've explained to me and the way I've been able to visualize it. So we looked at a number of things. We looked at the no build scenario, meaning I'm going to call anything in development area 1, just that, and that would include the 8.2, right? And then there's all the ancillary development that's outside of.
Okay.
So I'm going to call everything outside of development area 1 ancillary development, just for simplicity. Everything in there, fab development or development area 1 development. So just really quick, good foundation item. The thresholds that we're talking about explicitly do not apply to development area 1. These were the traffic thresholds that were set up exclusively for ancillary development. And we've taken those numbers, carved out the amount that we think should be remaining. And we can talk about how we came up with that carve out, because quite honestly, I said to the team, you went too low, and we boosted that carve out quite a bit to make sure there was sufficient left over for the ancillary development. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Well, the thing about intersections is they don't care where. the traffic
Yeah, so I was gonna
comes
say,
from.
so that's just when we talk about threshold, but for the analysis itself, we started with the no build scenario is no development area 1 at all development, no ancillary development, whether or not this PDD amendment, just nothing happening at Luther Forest at all, status quo, but for normal growth. And that's the analysis that we got. It shows you what impact that'll have. It's just normal growth with nothing happening at Luther Forest. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
And then in the build scenario, just the normal build scenario, that's purely just adding ancillary development into the mix, which is the thresholds that currently exist in the PDD. we can all, I think to Stu's point, it's a question for the board of, are those thresholds still valid or not? That's a different conversation we can have right now. I think today's the day for that, but neither here nor there. And then, so we show the necessary mitigation.
What you
Can I
described,
just ask John before you go on? So when you say no build in here, that means no 8.2, no Scanal project.
Nothing. at
No
Winter
build is no
Forest.
build.
Nothing. at Winter
Can I
Forest.
ask a question? Why is that normal development? A no build
just-
anywhere?
So a
What
no,
we've seen for the last 20 years.
yeah, and the no build accounts for general growth and also other projects that we identified that were, given to us by the town that they're approved or they're coming. And so the volumes for those developments outside of LFTC campus that are, in the mix that are coming forward, that volume is going to be added into the system.
But
So
normal growth doesn't in any way include growth at the campus?
correct,
That's
that's
no build.
And
considered our
so
build.
the
condition.
statistics that you base this on are exclude LFTC
Right,
to be part of that growth.
So,
Correct.
so to that
Multi-intergenerational.
point, and I don't want to introduce further confusion, but the planned growth and the no growth scenario are where I get a little nervous here when we start talking about numbers. I have a question, but I want to clarify something first. When you said you didn't have certain info, is that you weren't able to get that information from Global Foundries or Creighton Manning regarding traffic data? Or what did that mean?
I'll take it. We did request the opportunity to coordinate with both of those entities and were not provided any assistance.
Okay.
you asked for-
So-
Tim is asking you if you asked for the actual traffic data for them during this.
I can tell you we did, and
Okay.
we were not able to coordinate with them.
Thank you.
We
So
got- yeah.
related to that, and this is where I get confused, is I sat through a fantastic program put on by SEDC earlier this year, where Creighton Manning did a great presentation on traffic volume in the exit 11 and 12 corridors. And one of the points I'm looking at in this is that the traffic volume from 2015 to 2019, explicitly traffic on Route 9, I-87, Route 67, was at 50% of planned growth projection. So I'm wondering, and that the residential permits were tracking at only about 70% of planned growth. So it seems to me that Creighton Manning perhaps has some really great data here that would be helpful to you guys to understand, because, we obviously, what we're supposed to be reviewing here is the traffic impact of the Scanal project and the proposed PDD amendments for these development areas. And I think taking suppositions about projects that may or may not happen from other applicants in other areas, well, it's not, unimportant. I feel like some of this is we're having to deal with one hand tied behind our back when it comes to data. So I have a concern there, and I think we as a town board need to understand that we're dealing with an applicant here, and it's one applicant. And we need to be reflective of the data that's being provided by the applicant. If they don't have data from other impacted sources, I think I don't know that that's really on them. But I think there's probably some greater confusion there. And I'm hopeful that we can focus on really what we've asked the applicant to convey and what's appropriate for this application, and make sure that we actually have the best information available.
I'm gonna, Stu, I'm just gonna kind of supplement my question earlier in terms of your memo and the CME analysis that shows, it shows phase 4 threshold of 2,400 and 2,500. And I always am hesitant to rule out possibilities that I don't know what I'm talking about. So are those thresholds for pod 1 traffic impacts into, or are they thresholds for the entirety of the campus? And how did those thresholds of 2,400 and 2,500 relate to the 1,900 and 2,100 that the applicant is saying are available? I'm confused.
Well, John, I'd have to go back and look. And that's why, I'm being transparent with you. I need my expert here, and I need to review that record. And it's a little frustrating to listen to the conversation because you guys are deep in the weeds, which is fine, but you don't have the fellow that's representing you here to help you. And I think that's frustrating to me because I can't help you to the extent that I wish I could. And I'm sure it's frustrating to you, but that's, you know, the fact of life we're dealing with here tonight.
I guess if we're in the weeds, I'm a thorny weed then.
Well, we've come down from 30,000 to about 100 feet, I think. So, maybe the best thing is to pick this up on November 8th, not make a decision on completeness, postponing that decision to November 8th, and take it from there. Is that acceptable to the board?
It is, and I would look forward to get Tom's feedback. He can review the CME submission and say, you know, line item 1 in their list is really incorporated in line item 3 of mine, so that we can just tick off to make sure that
He would have been able to answer that question very quickly, I am sure. But we've taken detailed notes. I'll sit with him early next week and we'll go through what you need to know.
Okay, that sounds good. Is this acceptable to you
Yes.
guys? Okay. All right, we're good. We're adjourned. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you on the 8th. Thank you so much.
Now I gotta make it back to California.
So I thought I understood.